Welcome back, Year 3. Welcome to our writing session based around using or writing poetry. The ally is the same as yesterday, to write own verses of a poem to describe the characteristics of an animal. You know the routine. You need a pencil or a pen and a paper or a book, and you're in control of the pause button. Now, there won't be as much pausing as there was in our reading comprehension lesson, fortunately. But if you do need to slow down, you need to do or catch up with something, then use the pause button and then restart when you're ready. So let's start the session. We're going to introduce similes and metaphors next week, but before we do that, let's do a really quick recap on what is a simile. We have used similes in the autumn and the spring term. So what is a simile? A simile describes something by comparing it to something else, using like or as. For instance, the snake moved like a ripple on a pond. It was as slippery as an eel. Jess is as graceful as a gazelle. So we're in those sentences, the word like or as is used, which then gives us a clue that that sentence has a simile in it. Metaphor is a bit more complicated. So what is a metaphor? A metaphor is a word or a phrase used to describe something as if it were something else. Poets and authors or writers love using similes and metaphors because it gives the reader a much clearer image in their head of what's happening in the narrative or story or poem. So, for example, a wave of terror washed over him. The terror isn't actually a wave, but a wave is a good way of describing the feeling that the character has. So if you have a wave of terror washing over you, it means that you are overtaken with being very, very frightened. And the next metaphor is Jess is dynamite. Now, in reality, Jess is not made of dynamite, but it's a way to explain how exciting she is, or how magnificent Jess is after having done something. Now, we won't watch a video today about similes and metaphors. We will save that for tomorrow. So let's move on with the lesson. Okay, we have the poem that we did yesterday, Rathers and My Invisible Dragon. If you look at those two poems, it's always very, very good to look at how are these poems the same or different. It's what we did yesterday. I've just reduced the things that we're going to compare today. So punctuation. How does punctuation affect how the reader reads the poem? Well, if I start with Rathers, I can read the first verse of Rathers, and I'm going to be controlled by the punctuation. So I know very well what I'd rather be if I didn't always have to be me. I'd rather be an owl, a downy feathered owl, a winkety blinkety yellow-eyed owl in a hole in a hollow tree. I'm going to stop there. So you can see that different punctuation has been used by Mary Hunter Austin, the poet. She's used an exclamation mark, she's used a comma. Now, when I read, need to stop or pause depending on the punctuation being used. So the poet can control the speed that I read at. Now, that helps the reader with understanding the poem. Some things are going to be stressed, so the reader needs to know about all the information that's been read. So it really helps them to picture what's happening in the poem. Now, if I read My Invisible Dragon, if you look now, you can see that in the first line, after dragon, there's a full stop. And then after fly in the second line, there's another full stop. And then in the third line, there's no punctuation, but on the fourth line, there's a third full stop. So I'm going to be controlled by the poet, and I can only read at a certain speed depending on the punctuation. So let me start. I have an invisible dragon. She's such a remarkable flyer. She soars through the sky on visible wings, exhaling invisible fire. Now that controls the speed that I can read at, but also it gives the listener or the audience the chance to take in the information. So if you look at the first line, I have an invisible dragon, then they have time to think about what's the reader or narrator just said. An invisible dragon. She's such a remarkable flyer. So that's a second characteristic about the dragon that the reader finds out about. Now if I read it really quickly, the audience may miss out on all that important information. And if you miss out on that important information, your understanding of the poem may not be as good as it needs to be. So punctuation is important. There's alliteration. Well, if you look in My Invisible Dragon, in the second verse on the second line, the alliteration stands out. She soundlessly swoops through the air. So once again, they all have the same sound. She soundlessly swoops, and those words all happen to start with the letter S. But if you look at rathers, it's quite difficult to actually find alliteration. It doesn't stand out as much. So poets don't always use alliteration. It depends on what they are trying to get the listener to pay attention to, or help the listener to understand. Sometimes it helps with the rhythm of the poem. Everything flows very easily. So alliteration can be important in a poem. Rhyme. If we look at rathers, we can see in verse 1, line 1 ends with the word be, and at the end of line 2 ends with the word me. Be and me rhyme. And then in line 3 at the end, and line 4 and line 5, they all end with the same word al. And of course, those three words rhyme. And then on the next line, the last word is tree. And that rhymes with the last line of verse 1, me. And below that you've got town and down. So rhyme is very important in rathers. And it does make it a bit more musical, gives a good sense of rhythm and good feel. And in dragon, can you see any rhyming words? Well, if you look at line 2, at the end is flyer. And at the end of line 4 is the word fire. So you've got, she's such a remarkable flyer, exhaling invisible fire. So rhyme in both poems actually is very apparent. And if you look in verse 2 of My Invisible Dragon, in the second line at the end is air, and the last word in the fourth line is there, air and there. So rhyme for both poems seems to be part of how the poem is constructed. Verses and stanzas. If you look at rathers, got 2 verses or stanzas, and the stanzas in rathers are longer. So if you look at how many lines there are in each verse of rathers, it's apparent that there are more lines in verse 1 of rathers than there is in My Invisible Dragon. So sometimes that can help the poet introduce lots of information so that the reader has a good understanding, or sometimes a poet prefers to have less lines in a verse so that the reader can pick up the information very, very quickly and not get overloaded with too much. So the number of verses and how many lines are in the verse can be an important part of the poem. Let's now move to My Invisible Dragon. Well, I've deliberately color-coded parts of My Invisible Dragon. You may have, in the reading comprehension session, picked up on some of these things. So it's the first 3 verses. In that kind of brownish yellowy color, she's such, she soars, she soundlessly swoops, they are all forms of, yes, alliteration. Why are they alliteration? Something that you need to be aware of all the time. And then I've highlighted words in red. Now these words all rhyme. Flyer, fire, air, there, much, touch. So when you study poetry, or when you're reading a book, you need to analyze things very carefully. All of these things are done for a good reason. Now you may not have realized, but the punctuation in My Invisible Dragon, in each verse there are 3 full stops. Always in line 1 there's a full stop, at the end of line 2 there's a full stop, and at the end of line 4 there's a full stop. Now that is repeated in every verse of My Invisible Dragon. And they tend to be quite short sentences, so the reader gets a small amount of information, but that information the listener gets lots of information, and it's important that when you hear it or you read it, you stop and think about, now what is happening in this poem? What do I know? What information have I picked up about? So understanding is always very, very important. Right, so let's move on to our writing activity. It's very similar to yesterday. So you need to think of an animal that you would like to be. It might be the animal that you used yesterday. And you need to list some of the characteristics and actions of your animal. They might be similar or the same characteristics that you had for your animal yesterday. And before you start writing your poem, you need to think about using alliteration, rhyme, and where to use it. Now you also need to think about the punctuation. Now if we're going to follow the structure of a poem, you need to follow the punctuation that the poet has used in My Invisible Dragon. So at the end of line 1, full stop. At the end of line 2, full stop. At the end of line 3, there's no punctuation, but at the end of line 4, there's a full stop. So think about the structure of this poem and how the poet uses punctuation. So you need to replicate that or do the same thing. Okay, so task 2, like yesterday's draft, you do a draft copy. So you're going to focus on creating your own version of verse 1 and 2. And those who want a bit of an extension, you could try verse 3 if you like. So what do you do first? Well, you need to have a title for your poem. So your poem is going to start with my, and you have a characteristic. The dragon was invisible, and the animal is dragon. So what characteristic goes with your animal? My fierce tiger. Could be something like that. Up to you. So that depends on the animal that you select. Okay, so verse 1, how does this work? If we follow the same format as the poem, line 1 starts with, I have an invisible. Now you can decide whether or not you want to have an invisible animal. It doesn't have to be invisible. An invisible dragon here tells us that this person has this make-believe creature. And as you read the poem, you begin to realize, actually, you know what? That creature doesn't really exist. But hopefully you picked up on that in reading comprehension. So you can choose, is your creature going to be invisible? If not, it doesn't matter. So line 2, it starts with she's such. Well, it depends on, is your animal a male or female? If it's male, you're going to use he's. If it's female, you will use she's. She's such a remarkable, and then you have to put the characteristic. What is remarkable about that particular animal you've chosen? And then line 3, you use he or she. You start with he or she, and then you need to write down the action of the animal. So the dragon, she soars through the sky on invisible wings. Now the poet did use alliteration there. Could you try and use alliteration with your action or characteristic? It's up to you. And line 4, it finishes with an action. So 3 and 4 go together. And then if you go to verse 2, you're going to start with line 1, and the first word is my. And you will have noticed that it starts with a capital M. So my, what is the animal and characteristic? So in the poem, in the beginning of verse 2, line 1, my dragon is utterly silent. So my, whatever your animal is, and the characteristic that goes with your animal. And line 2, he or she, you need an action. And of course you can see that in verse 2, she soundlessly swoops is in that yellowish brown colour. Alliteration. Could you come up with an alliteration for line 2 with your action? And line 3, you can start with why, he, she, could be, and then you write down your action. And finally, line 4, that'll be up to you. You can choose how you want to finish off line 4. But line 3 and 4 go together. So it depends on what's happening in line 3. Okay, so if you've done a draft copy, you may have chosen to just try and do your good copy, but if you have time, you do a final copy with an illustration if you have time. And once again, once you're ready, please email your work to yr3@grange.harrow.school.uk. Enjoy your task. I look forward to reading your wonderful poetry. Take care for now. Bye. Speak to you tomorrow.